So with that, I'm just going to quickly read bios for both of our speakers, and I'm going to turn it over to them. Amy Yee is an award-winning journalist, most recently with Bloomberg City Lab, and previously a Financial Times correspondent in New York and India, where she lived for 7 years. She's written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, NPR, and 30+ media outlets. She won the United Nations Correspondents Association Award 3 times, 4 awards from the South Asian Journalists Association, and first place from the Association of Healthcare Journalists for analysis about reducing deaths of children in India and Bangladesh. In 2023, she won the Asian American Journalists Association's Award for Political Reporting about protecting voting rights of immigrant voters, and the Society of Professional Journalists Award for Racial Equity Reporting. She's had 4 notable essays in the Best American Essays. She's reported from 20+ countries, including 10 in Africa. She's a McDowell and Logan Nonfiction Fellow and a graduate of Harvard Kennedy School, Columbia Journalism School, Wellesley, and Hunter College's MFA program. She will be in conversation with Jyoti Thottam, who leads the editorial board of the New York Times, which she joined in March 2018, and is the author of Sisters of Muhammad, published by Viking in 2022. Prior to the Times, she was a reporter, editor, and foreign correspondent for Time magazine, where she spent 4 years as South Asia bureau chief, as well as Al Jazeera America and local newspapers in New York and Florida. Her work has appeared in The Believer, The Village Voice, and many other publications. She was born in India, grew up in Sugarland, Texas, and graduated from Yale University and Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. She lives with her family in Brooklyn. Over to Amy and Jyoti. Thank you both.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks to the Asian American Writers Workshop for organizing this. It's played such a formative role. I know I've heard from you, Amy, and I think for many of us who've come up in New York in particular as writers. So it's really wonderful to be here. So Amy, this is such a special book, and I know you sort of describe in the first part of the book kind of the spark for actually starting to write it, but I, rather than sort of go into the part that's like actually in the book, I was wondering if you, because I know you traveled to Tibet, years earlier, before the sort of the action of the book takes place. I wonder if you could sort of reflect on that early visit and how that informed your work with the diaspora, since it's so different, and your book is unique in that way, in that it really is about these experiences of living in the diaspora rather than in Tibet.
Right. Yeah, no, that is really important, and thank you to Asian American Writers Workshop. I took classes here in my youth when I first moved to New York, and was learning to be a journalist and a writer. So I took many classes here. I love this place, and thank you, Jyoti, for doing this. It's such a busy time, and I really appreciate you doing this. So I did live in China for 2 years. I was teaching English right after college, and then at the end of the 2 years, I was backpacking, traveling, and I was in Tibet for 3 weeks. This was the late 90s, and it was very different than what I saw in other parts of China where I traveled. Namely, that there was a sense of unease. There was a lot of military and lots, trucks with soldiers. You could feel, there was unease, and there was surveillance as well. And so when I went to Dharamsala in India in 2008, it was a really different experience. And in March 2008, the protests in Tibet were happening, and at the time it was the most unrest and most violence since Tiananmen Square. So it was a big deal. That's why all the foreign correspondents went up there. And so I did not realize that Dharamsala was quite like this haven for Tibetans. And I think that's one of the you know, incredible things about India, incredible India. You know, there's always something new to learn there. So I didn't really know that much about Dharamsala. And when I went there, Tibetans were in the streets protesting and demonstrating, and they were marching up and down the roads with, you know, banners and signs and Tibetan flag, and huge outpouring of support. You know, people were carrying the Dalai Lama's photo, of course, in the rallies. And then if you in Tibet, you can be arrested for having its photo. You can certainly be arrested for having the Tibetan flag. And so to see all that in Dharamsala out on full display was really quite incredible.
Because you had seen what it was like in Tibet all the years earlier.
Saw what it was like in Tibet, and just to give you an idea, like just to back up from that, the first first and only time I was in Tibet, I had, you know, I was young, and I had some copies of the New Yorker, and at the time they were running this Apple ad, like, you know, visionaries, and they had a picture of the Dalai Lama, and I said, oh, I'll photocopy them and give them to people when I'm in Tibet. And when I got there, I was like, I'm not doing that. I felt like I could get in deep trouble, or, you know, worse. So I completely realized that was
not a good idea.
Yeah. And so I did not give those pictures away. So then to see all this happening in Dharamsala was like, you know, pretty incredible. And there was also not only that, but also the draw of seeing how this was like a microcosm of Tibet in this little town in India, and to see Tibetan identity and culture display. And that was really intriguing to me. And so that was the one of the compelling factors. Yeah.
So, you know, so again, like that particular time, March 2008, it's still, you know, it's considered really like the peak of the protests movement. Did you have a sense there, again, since this was a diaspora, like what was your sense of the kind of communication between Tibet, or how the information was coming? Because that, again, is like one of the ways that I feel like this diaspora community in some ways is distinct from other diasporas, is that communication can be so difficult. I mean, just because of the nature of how things are in Tibet. Like, what was your sense of it at that time?
One of the a really vivid memory was in the streets, there were posters, like blown up photos of bodies in Tibet, and corpses, really. So there was a crackdown of protests in Tibet, and people were killed. So there were photos of the Tibetans who were killed with bullet holes in their heads or their bodies. And the reason we had those photos was the bodies were taken into a monastery called Jyoti Monastery. And the monks there took the photos intentionally to send them to the outside world. And so, however, I suppose it must have been by phone, text, maybe it was email, I can't quite remember. But they managed to get these photos out, and they sent it to their like sibling monastery. There's a Kirti monastery in Dharamsala, so they are in close communication. So the Kirti monastery in Dharamsala got those photos, and then they like sprang into action and made those photos into posters and plastered them all over the streets of Dharamsala. And then another memory I have is a monk who was standing outside one of the exile government buildings in Dharamsala. So Dharamsala is the hub of the Tibetan exile government. And this monk was giving out like CDs with the photos, and then flyers as well. And he didn't speak much English, so we actually spoke in Mandarin, and then there was also a woman with him translating, but he was a monk with Jyoti, so they were like deliberately passing these out.
Right. So that's so interesting. So the two branches of the Kirti monastery were in contact with each other. Did you have a sense? I mean, you met so many Tibetans who were living in Dharamsala at the time. What was communication like for them with their families who were still in Tibet, and like how important was that in terms of, it's like I almost imagine these like parallel communities.
Yeah, it was like a parallel. That was the other fascinating thing about Dharamsala. It's like a parallel universe. So, there was some communication. The Kirti connection. I actually wrote an article about that for the Christian Science Monitor. So I should go back and look at the details of what I wrote in 2009 or whatever it was, 10. But in general, the information that was transmitted to the outside world did come from inside Tibet, and how they did that, whether, this was pre-smartphones.
Yeah, exactly.
So it must have been like text and emails and maybe actual phone calls. But it's also dangerous for people, and people were aware. And then in the aftermath of those protests, there was a huge clampdown on communication. So 1 year later, in 2009, when I was there was like a communication blackout, and it was really hard to get information from inside Tibet.
Yeah.
But at that time in 2008, there was enough flow of information out to get those photos out, to get some, accounts out of what was going on around. And then a year later, that was completely different.
Yeah. No, 2008 was such such an important year. And in fact, that was, I'm not sure if this was the first time you and I met, but I was in, I started my posting in South Asia in the summer of 2008. So I think you described this in the book. One of the big meetings in Dharamsala, I think it was in
November.
It was in November of 2008, like when they were doing it was a big sort of political meeting, parliament, and people had come from all over the world I think they were having debates. I don't think it was a vote. It might have been a vote in the parliament.
Yeah,
but,
I think it was just like a summit.
But I also remember very distinctly, the Dalai Lama having audiences, and there was almost this like, anytime he was around, there's this sort of like electric thing about like you sort of knew that he was around somewhere. He definitely has that presence. And so you describe your first meeting with him on a reporting trip in March of that year. And I sort of think of him in a way, almost inevitably, as this sort of a character, a figure that sort of reappears at different points throughout your book, although you're obviously telling the story of these individuals. And he is, of course, perhaps the Tibetan that most of your readers would be most familiar with. I'm really curious, like what you, having met him on a couple different occasions, like how you came, like did your view of him change in the years that you were reporting the book?
Yeah. So just to give some context, March 2008 was my first time there, and then I was literally running to a press conference that I was late for, because I was in Bangalore the previous day, which is in southern India, and I had to get all the way up to northern India in 8 hours or whatever it was. So it was quite a journey, and literally was running to the press conference. It was late, and so I sat on the floor. There were no seats left, and then afterwards, it's a 2-hour press conference, so would think Dalai Lama would want to leave, but he saw me and he made a beeline towards me, and then he was like, "Oh, Chinese, right?" And I'm American. I was born in the U.S. and grew up here. And after listening to what was happening in Tibet for 2 hours, with Chinese government cracking down pretty violently. Thousands of arrests would happen over the next few months. I wasn't sure what to say, but I said, yeah, I'm American. But he was really excited to see a Chinese, ethnically Chinese person, and so he, grabbed my face and like squeezed my cheeks, and he said, Tibet and China, it's between us. We must discuss. And he actually said, these others, meaning the other journalists, he's like, they're just for show. And he said, it's between us, we must discuss, and you must tell them. And then he hugged me. So that's the start of the book. And, don't usually get hugged by the subject of who you're reporting on. So it was unexpected for sure. But that was my first, time meeting him in person. And so, yes, like over the course of many years, I've seen him in different settings. And I think one of the most interesting or eye-opening settings was in a audience with Tibetans who had just arrived in India. And anyone who just arrives in India from Tibet, they stay in Dharamsala until they can meet him in person. So it's like a required audience. I mean, they want to,
Of course, yeah.
But I think it's also to have, establish a bond. So I saw him give an audience to newly arrived Tibetans in December, I think, 2008. And he was really different. And he, most people in the outside world, they think of him as like a jolly, happy, joking, smiling, and which he is, but that's one persona. And he's not just this like kind of smiling, joking teddy bear or something like that. And actually his credentials as a Buddhist scholar, he's like PhD postdoctoral stuff, like very high level philosopher basically. So when I saw him in the audience, giving the audience privately, he was really serious. And as he would be, to people who would just risk their lives, many of them walking for days and days. And he, I described in the book that he was sort of like a concerned father with only a short time, to talk to, children or, to people he was caring for. It was like this urgency, there was an urgency, and it was definitely serious. Talk to them, and he was actually he was sort of exhorting them to study. I mean, that was one of the main things, like to study hard, to be educated, to have modern education. That was actually probably one of the biggest things he said. But he also did say, when if you go back, you can tell others what you've seen here and what you've heard here as well, and wanting the flow of information to be, to speak the truth, really. So yeah, that was really eye-opening. But that chapter where I described that chapter actually then ends up being about the Tibetan education system.
Yeah.
It seemed like a good way to peg that theme to his the focus of his audience, which you wouldn't necessarily expect that, like him like exhorting people to study and to be have modern education.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I know you in that chapter, and I think really throughout the book, you sort of talk about the role of the Tibetan school, the Tibetan TCV, the Tibetan Children's Village, like how important that is to. I mean, it's not just important. It is really the vehicle for the Tibetan nationhood to kind of continue given the political situation.
Yeah.
Did you have a sense that again, in sort of talking, like you got to know so many individual Tibetans, the characters in your book, did you have, like, how much did they sort of talk about those
Yeah.
ideas that, you know, that they were in a sense kind of carrying the Tibetan nation or idea of nationhood with them?
Oh, I interviewed the head of the school, and he did, say something exactly along those lines, like the hope of the future of Tibet is with our children, for example. And then, Tibetans who have gone to TCV, to the Tibetan Children's Village, they say it was, pivotal in their lives. Definitely not saying it's like the perfect education system. Sure, it's not at all, but in the schools, with our Tibetan language, the history, culture, arts, and so on. And it's also, conforms with the Indian curriculum too, because it has to. But it's really unique. Not, I don't know if someone knows of another country where, a guest country can teach in their own language and have their unique curriculum that still conforms to the national one, let me know. I'm not sure if something else like that exists. So I met Tibetans who were born in India, never been to Tibet, but their Tibetan language skills are better than people from Tibet. Like that's how,
because they'd come up completely through the
yeah, especially maybe not with spoken Tibetan, but reading and writing. Yeah, so like Jyoti, she was one of the main Tibetans I followed. Her written Tibetan was maybe not that great, and she, her Mandarin, reading and writing Mandarin was better than Tibetan. She didn't learn Tibetan language in school. So verbally, yes, she's fluent, but interestingly, her Mandarin reading and writing is better, I think. And then there's another person who shows up. He's a lawyer. He's Indian from the area, and he went to the Tibetan schools from kindergarten.
That's right, because you say there are a few.
Yeah, there are a few like non-Tibetans who would
go
go
there. Yeah.
And then his Tibetan was like absolutely fluent. And then his Tibetan reading and writing would be better than some people from Tibet. So, and it's, through the school. But, definitely many Tibetans I met have talked about the influence of the schools. And how much it formed their formative years. And some of them, they don't have parents, so they live there. The person I spoke with on Monday at my other event, so I'm reason like he went to India when he was 10 or 11, and he hasn't seen his family since then. So it's also like a foster family.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of children without their parents there at all. Yeah, so it does become surrogate.
Right. Yeah,
Surrogate
essentially it's like a
family.
boarding school.
Yeah.
One of the again, a thread that is throughout the book that I really appreciated was, you sort of gently sometimes remind the reader, or you sort of explain how your facility in Mandarin, like you'd sometimes like could communicate or connect with people, Tibetans, because they had at least spent part of their lives in China. So of course, like they had to speak Mandarin, and you would sometimes speak to them, and it was a really interesting kind of back and forth sometimes, because you're American, but from Chinese background, you spoke Mandarin, but you're speaking to them in India, sort of a third country. So I'm really curious if you could talk a little bit more about that, like your relationship to the language, their relationship to Chinese language, and sort of, did you find it to be kind of a way to connect with them, to sort of share?
Yeah, totally. It was total bridge with Deki and Dundup, they're a couple. Dundup's the husband, like we spoke in Mandarin. And because they fled in the winter of 2008, suddenly, because they had helped a monk friend photocopy flyers during the March 2008 protests. And then he was arrested. And then they quickly they decided their lives were in danger and they left everything. So they didn't speak English and I don't speak Tibetan and they had just arrived in India. So yeah, we spoke in Mandarin and my Mandarin is proficient and like we also would sometimes use like, you know, Deki had this little like digital dictionary, which wasn't very good, like gave terrible translations, but we could piece together. But yeah, that's how it's like the only way we could communicate really. And then by the time I saw them later, I saw them because they got asylum in Belgium and her English had improved so much.
I know their story is so interesting.
Yeah.
Like how they to Belgium. I don't want to spoil the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah, so they ended up getting asylum, so I did get to visit them in Leuven in Belgium. And her English was much better, and she seemed to be like she wanted to speak more English. Like a sense of pride about it. It seemed. And then in the other times when I mean people in Dharamsala would like come up to me or like call out ni hao or something, and I'm just walking around and did not want to, you know, I wasn't putting that out there first, and they would approach me, which was very surprising. But I asked people, you know, why you might think like, oh, they would not want to speak the language of this country that's oppressing theirs, but I mean a couple things. Well, one of the big ones I'll come back to in a minute is just the Dalai Lama is often he encourages outreach to Chinese people, and that's why he came up to me in the beginning of the book and at that press conference. So he gives that message constantly. And then I do think a lot of Tibetans feel like it's a practical skill to learn Mandarin, and they don't necessarily, you know, at least the ones I met, like for Deki, you know, for her to speak Mandarin is essential for her to get a job,
just to survive.
Yeah. And so there were, you know, I saw some classes in Dharamsala where they were teaching Mandarin.
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
I mean, to anyone.
Yes, to Tibetans.
Oh, to other Tibetans.
To other Tibetans, and it was like Tibetans who spoke Mandarin teaching Tibetans.
Oh, wow.
So it was really like a skills thing. And actually I visited that one class one time, and the Tibetans got excited because they thought they could speak with me in Mandarin or something, and
Which they could.
but you know, their teacher's Mandarin is much better than mine. So then, yeah, there were a number of times when some Tibetans, there was an elderly Tibetan woman I met in southern India, in the largest Tibetan settlement called Bailakupi, and she came up to me speaking Mandarin, and she was sort of disappointed that I'm not from China, I'm American, and she kind of left after she was like, "Oh, you're not, yeah, you're not from China."
Right.
So yeah, no, she came up to me speaking Mandarin.
So you mentioned Deki and, you know, her journey from you know, she ends up in Belgium, and, you know, since you did work on this book over the course of many years, you had a chance to sort of follow several of the characters that sort of moved from place to place, you know, from one country to another. And I'm really curious, like since you have seen how their lives have changed over time, what's your sense of, you know, again, because they're coming from a place where the the survival of Tibet, the idea of Tibet as a nation is in relation to its survival, confronted by China, its confrontation with China. What's your sense for the people in your book whom you got to know so well? Do they still think of, are they just sort of living their lives wherever they are? Do they still think about Tibet as a place? Is it simply, sort of something they carry with them?
Oh, yeah. Yes, it is. And let's say for Deki and Dunda, they're without a doubt they are Tibetan. And even though, they speak Mandarin, even though Deki's favorite food is Sichuan hot pot, and even though in Belgium we made dumplings that are actually Chinese dumplings, not my request, by the way, it was what they made. And no, because I ask these questions a lot, do you feel Tibetan? She's like, of course we're Tibetan, we know we're Tibetan. And she also said, I had asked her about how they retain their Tibetan identity in Tibet if they couldn't have the Dalai Lama's photo or something like that, if they couldn't, practice religion freely. But she said something really striking. She said, of course we know we're Tibetan. Every Tibetan has a picture of the Dalai Lama inside their heart. So yes, Tibetans have a very strong connection to the Dalai Lama, for sure. And many Tibetans I spoke to who had walked like 22 days over glaciers, dangerous conditions. Like the first person we meet in the first chapter, Thottam, he almost had to turn around and he couldn't make it, but he had a vision of the Dalai Lama in his mind. And he said that was what.
Right, try it again. It's really
that's what helped him carry on and keep going. And then just to go back to the audience that I saw where the Dalai Lama greeted new arrivals. Just afterwards, there was sort of like a stunned silence. And then people, were so overwhelmed with emotion. They were crying. Sometimes when I asked Tibetans later, like, oh, what do you remember of the first time you saw Dalai Lama? And they'll say they were just so overwhelmed with emotion. They don't really remember much. It's just like a daze. So yeah, the connection is really strong. So, that was one of the most fascinating things about, and what drew me is like the sense of identity in Tibet is so strong in spite of everything, in spite of the repression in Tibet, in spite of like being transplanted in another country.
So again, since you did you reported this book and wrote this book over many years, you had the chance to follow these people over many years. I also really appreciate it, and I feel like for this audience, and we're in the Asian American Writers Workshop, you also sort of reveal some of the challenges of not only reporting the story of this book, but also the challenges of being a writer, being a freelancer, getting published, kind of pursuing what you wanted to do as a book. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that for this audience. What were some of the biggest reporting challenges? How did you were there avenues of reporting that you didn't pursue that you might have otherwise, or just like the publishing journey? I feel like that's something that writers don't talk about enough, and it's so fascinating.
Yeah, so when I started the book, I was with the Financial Times, and then I left and I moved to Dharamsala and I was freelancing, and then actually, you may not know this, but I worked for a microfinance company.
No, I remember that. Yeah.
Okay, so I was doing a bunch of things, and then meanwhile still trying to, every year after I stopped living in Dharamsala, I'd still go back every year and write some articles and see people. So yeah, this book almost didn't happen, so it's, sort of a miracle, I think, that it did in the end. So just on the book side of things, this was not a linear journey at all. I didn't know if it would get published. When I started the book, there was an agent who was interested, and I think that's why I kept going.
Right.
And then he lost interest. And then I had written so much. I was like, well, I've done so much already. I'll keep going. And then I was also at the same time reporting. So I probably wrote like 25 or so articles about Tibet issues over that span of time. And so it wasn't like I was only, banking on the book happening. I was still publishing articles. So, I mean, in a way that was super helpful, because at least like I could do incrementally. I was
Doing material for the book, you were able to.
Got material for the book, and a lot of the reporting is woven into the book. Like what the story I told about the Jyoti monastery monks. I later wrote a whole separate article about that. So that's on the book side, it just was, people lost interest. I can talk maybe more about the specifics of the challenges of publishing the book in a bit, but then in terms of freelancing, so the other thing I'll mention is that a lot of this reporting, later reporting, I cobbled together with reporting for the book and then reporting on articles that had nothing to do with the book. So for the chapter about southern India in Bailakupi, I mean, the reason I got to go down to the state of Karnataka was I was writing an article about solar energy in India. Selco, I don't know if you came across them. They were one of the biggest solar energy companies. So I was writing an article. I wrote a lot about renewable energy, climate change, environment. And so I realized if I wrote this article on solar energy, it would put me close to where Bailakupi, this Tibetan settlement, was. So I intentionally then did organized a different reporting trip for the Tibetan issues. But I wrote an article about solar, and I finished writing the article in a little guest house in the just outside of the Tibetan settlement. I was on deadline, and I remember finishing that there in the guest house, and then just cobbling. That was how I got there. And then the other interesting part of that story is that I didn't know how I was going to get back to Delhi, because I could justify going down there, and the solar company dropped me off, and then I didn't know how I was going to get back. And so the guest house owners told me that there was a bus. So the Tibetan settlement is 5 hours south of Bangalore, fairly far. And I didn't know how I was going to get back to Bangalore, but the guest house owners told me there was a bus I could take. Then I just had to stand on the road at like 11:30, and then it would stop, and I could get on, and it would take me to Bangalore. And I was like, really? And it did happen. So I just went out to the road with my LV backpack, and the bus came out, and it came out of the dark, and there was nothing else on the road. And the driver was surprised to see me, and I was surprised to see him. And then I got to Bangalore at like 4:30 in the morning. The bus even went to the airport for some reason.
Oh, wow.
So I got there in time, early for my flight. So it worked out really well.
Yeah, it's amazing. You could see how the passion for the story sort of keeps you going, like you knew you.
Yeah.
So I mean, the particular kind of reporting you're doing, when you're trying to kind of write about people's lives and how they change over time, it can be so challenging. And there's such a clearly sort of a warmth between you and Jackie, the other people in the book. Like how did you, what were the, what would you say to people who are sort of interested in doing that kind of writing when you're really sort of you know, you're reporting, but it's like, about people's intimate lives, their experiences, their feelings.
Well, I am and was like genuinely interested, and so if you're not, then it's not, it's hard to sustain that, to be like genuinely interested and care about the people and the things you're writing about. And I spent a lot of time because I really benefited from living there. As a journalist, you like come in, and I the first time I was in Dharamsala, I did get to spend like 6 days, or which is a long time for journalists. Usually it's like in and out, and then you move on to the next story, and that's the news cycle. And then when I was living there, it was really immersive. And I'd never lived in a small town before, and in Dharamsala, I would just be walking around, you see people all the time, and you bump into them, and you see them at the restaurants, and it's easy to meet up with people. So I'm not sure if I had not been living there. But, I also wanted to live there. I wouldn't say, go and live there to like, I wanted to live there anyway. So, I mean, it was definitely a huge amount of time.
Yeah.
But I wanted to do it, and it was intriguing, so interesting.
Yeah, the description of Dharamsala and Latvian is also wonderful in the book. So we have an audience who can see is really eager to ask some questions. You guys have been paying such close attention, so I want to leave some time for audience questions. For Amy, I'm sure you all come to this subject in different ways. So. So Amy, do you want to talk about like maybe your next project? Are you thinking about writing another book or following these characters further in their lives?
I mean, I was actually working on a different nonfiction book, and then accidentally got a contract for this one. So I'm not sure if we will. I mean, the original plan was to work on another book, and I haven't had much time to think about, what's after this, because I just need to finish everything on my plate in the next couple of weeks. But the other project was the Chaldean community in Detroit. So,
Oh, interesting.
Chaldeans?
Chaldean Christians.
Yeah. How do you know who they are? Just like most people.
Well, I mean, I have a degree in religious studies, so that's early Christian communities, and I'm generally familiar with, but also like my family in India are Syrian Christian, so I don't know. I think I'm, have just sort of a pet interest in these kind of what seem to other people to be kind of obscure Christian communities in different parts of the world. So, the Chaldeans are a Catholic minority in Iraq, and the Detroit area is the largest population of them outside of Iraq. And I met a young Chaldean American guy in Croatia on a boat, and he told me some of his family story, and I just thought it was like, how it is, someone tells you something, and then that would be a great magazine article. So it does have to do with entrepreneurship and how his family and other Chaldean families got themselves out of financial trouble after the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. And Detroit was like the epicenter of the recession. So it would be a really interesting, again, it's intersectional. And it has to do with, culture and different generations and identity.
but it's nuanced, so, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure if, I wonder if it's better to do something that's simpler to understand. That's kind of one of my questions.
Simpler than the Tibetan diaspora, or?
I mean, I think this book is about many different things. It's about Tibetan diaspora, it's about refugees, it's about identity. So it's about multiple things, and the book published industry is like, it's an industry, and I wonder if it's better, or I think it's easier to do something that doesn't have so many complexities.
It's about one thing, right?
Yes,
One place,
like you
yeah.
can put in one sentence, like it's about this, and it has a plot like this. I mean, actually, that's what movies do. That's what a log is. It's like, so I don't know what, I mean, do you have any thoughts about that? Like if something is too complicated and complex, whether.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like on some level, the layers of a book give readers sort of different ways of understanding a story. So I think that can be an advantage as well. Although, yeah, I think I feel like if there is sort of one through line, that can really help also kind of bring readers along. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, just the immigrant's journey, someone who's just what I found really compelling in the personal story was just that feeling of an individual who sort of leaves their home for somewhere else. Like that's a story that is so universal,
right? And that's why I do think, I don't really believe this is that hard to understand, because as you say, this feeling is universal. It's I would think many immigrants feel this way, but you don't even have to be an immigrant. You just have, this idea of, different sides of your identity. And now we have phrases like code switching, which, that wasn't around in 2008, and now people know what that means. Or, intersectional, that's another word that's popular now. And that idea of like overlapping identities, like, I think it's very common, whether it's like, someone who's from Nebraska and moved to New York and they feel in between, or if they, or something is as simple as that. But I think most people have different sides of their identity that they balance. Yeah. I guess I just want to say, I know we're almost out of time, but some people have, and just the idea of identity. That's why I was so fascinated with this, because I am, Asian American. I've always been fascinated and intrigued, and all of that by no questions. But
did you want to read?
I might just read a short passage, because some people have said to me, "Oh, but your book is about refugees, must be depressing," and I think
it's not depressing at all, for sure. The characters are so there's such a warmth between you and the people in the book, and they're so interesting. So yeah, I'd love for you to read.
I mean, so many of the stories are sad because people have left their families and homes and might never see them again. So fundamentally, that's sad. And what's the repression of Tibet. But people's stories and their stories and the way they comported themselves was really inspiring. So I think, again, that's another reason I could keep going, because I was really inspired by them and just had a lot of respect and admiration for people. And so there's just a short passage here. It was on the 50th anniversary of the Tibetan exile, which was 2009. So that was a big milestone. And I was in Dharamsala then, and there was a lot of anxiety about what would happen in Tibet. And this was the 1-year anniversary of those protests. And there was a big communication blackout and crackdown in Tibet. So a lot of anxiety and stress and tension. And I saw the prime minister of the exile government, and we sat down and just had an interview in the reception area where you go into the Dalai Lama's compound. So his name is Samdong Rinpoche, and he, at the time, I think was in his 70s, and he was talking about how he was anxious about, the situation in Tibet and the crackdown going on. But then I said to him, what did he remember of Tibet, and what did he think of the 50th anniversary of the exile? So Samdong Rinpoche seemed to visibly relax when I asked what the 50th anniversary of Tibetan exile meant to him. He sat up a little straighter, and for a moment his fatigue vanished. In the exhibition at the Tibet Museum, there were photos of Samdong Rinpoche from over the decades. One showed him as a much younger man, his face not yet gaunt and strained. Some of that vitality returned for a minute. He said, "My memories of my life spent in Tibet are more clear than memories of yesterday," he declared nostalgically. He looked into the distance and smiled. "I remember the colors and shapes of trees in our monastery and the friends we debated with. The last 50 years have seen tremendous change, unbelievable change, so I'm satisfied in many ways. The last 50 years have been the darkest in our history, but Tibetan culture has spread to all corners of the world. His Holiness is respected all over the world. This is a great achievement. We have modern education and at the same time traditional education. We must be satisfied." And he said, "The rigidness of Chinese leadership will also change. Sooner or later, China will have to be more democratic. Then the Tibet issue will be properly resolved. We have not wasted the past 50 years. We have used them properly." So, yeah, I think what he said is, Tibet is, there are very few people as well recognized and respected as the Dalai Lama. And people know Tibet all over the world, maybe, glimmers of, some more than others, but in general, people know about Tibet. And, the idea of that spreading after 50 years, I think is, what he said was really resonant. Yeah, and then there was just this other last thing, passage I'll read, and this was a brief conversation I had with a young Tibetan. It was in Sarnath, it's a Buddhist holy city, and I actually might have lost my sticky. Oh no, here it is. Bookmarks are helpful. So he was born in India, but was going to college in Hampshire College, which is in Western Mass. It's a very liberal arts college. And he was filming, and he was making a documentary. He was very his speech had a lot of Americanisms, and he was sort of like a hipster. And then I asked him, do you identify as Tibetan? And he said, and this is him, this is not every Tibetan, this is only him. He said, "I'm 40% Tibetan, 60% Indian." But then he mused eloquently about the plight of Tibetans. He said, "Any people who are devoid of land create their own small community wherever they go. That's the positive side of being a refugee. It's also beautiful. From one side, it's a terrible thing Tibet fell, but every day more and more people are getting into Tibetan Buddhism and everything Tibet." Kamram, his name was, he was overwhelmed just by the Dalai Lama's presence at the teaching. He said, "When you have so much reverence for someone, you will get goosebumps, your hair will stand up," he gushed. I'm always praying inside when I'm in his proximity. Then he confessed with a sheepish laugh. This is the 100th time I promised myself I'm going to quit smoking and drinking. So, yeah, I mean, one, person who reviewed, who she was like, she did a peer review of my books, I to go through academic peer review. She said something about how the book does paint Tibetans as contemporary people, which I appreciated. So, you know, Tibetans who really like basketball, Kobe Bryant, Tibetans who, you know, maybe they think they smoke and drink too much, or, you know, or they listen to the Black Eyed Peas. One Tibetan monk I met, he really liked the Black Eyed Peas, you know, so I appreciated her conscience. Yeah.
Great. Well, I hope you all have a chance to read more about all the characters in the book. Thank you, and
Thank
thanks
you.
to all you for hosting us.
Thank you all for being here. We do have books for sale, so let us know if you want. And thank you both for the conversation.
Thank you.